So it is 1 o'clock now, so I think we should start the webinar, and I'd like to start off by welcoming you to country, acknowledging the traditional inhabitants of the land we're meeting on today, the Aboriginal people, their spirits and ancestors. We acknowledge the vital contribution that Indigenous people and cultures have made and still make to the nation we share, Australia. So my name is Norma Shanky-Williams. Welcome, as I say, to the second of two webinars that we're conducting on our draft industrial land strategy. This one today is focusing on East Chatswood and Lane Cove North industrial areas, with last week's dealing with Artarmon. Joining us this afternoon will be Councillors Christine Tuan and Councillor Lynn Saville. And there's an apology from Councillor Wendy Norton, who would like to have been here this afternoon, but is unable to do so. Also here I have Tanya Stark, who's our engagement specialist here at Council, Ian Arnott, the planning manager, and either in presence physically or remotely, I have Jane Hosey and Jackie Mullard, both of whom who worked on the draft industrial land strategy for us, and Ian Shillington, who will also be involved ongoing. So we have 17 people registered for the webinar this afternoon, and I already have 5 questions that people have asked on the website, so I'll deal with those at the end of the presentation. The slide deck will take about 30 minutes or so to deliver, and then Tanya and Jane will relay any questions that maybe have come up during the webinar, and I'm happy to field those at the end of the presentation. And the intention is that this webinar will go on the website after today, and you can view it at a later date, should you so choose to do. So I'll just share my presentation with you now. So here we are this afternoon talking about the East Chatswood and Lane Cove North industrial lands strategy, aspects of the work we've done on these particular industrial areas. And hopefully you can see that first slide now. So I'd like to move through the presentation now and go through the slides as we go. I'm just trying to move those slides now. The agenda this afternoon will talk about the background and the context for our industrial lands, talk about a bit of the feedback that we've had to date, and some general principles for all of Willoughby Industrial Lands that we'd like to apply ongoing. And as I say, the focus for today will be on East Chatswood and the Lane Cove industrial areas in particular. So to get your bearings in terms of the local government area, you can see the Chatswood East industrial area up in the northeast part of the local government area, and that little part of the Lane Cove industrial area off to the west, along at the end of Mowbray Road West. The strategic planning context that we're working in, and this is in common with all our strategic work, is the Greater Sydney Region Plan, which was issued by the GSC, the Greater Sydney Commission, back in 2018, and included the district plans for all the districts of metropolitan Sydney, ours being the North District Plan. Our local strategic planning statement was finalised earlier this year, with assurance being given by the Greater Sydney Commission, and that sets our strategic land use direction for the next 20 years. Following on from that will be the work we've been doing already on our local centres, our housing, and the Chatswood CBD. And back in 2017, we actually issued a position paper on industrial lands, but it's only now that we're getting around to issuing the draft industrial land strategy. It's taken us a little while to get to that point. In terms of the state government plans, we have the Metropolis of 3 cities, which is the work that was done by the GSC in the region plan, and talks about industrial and urban services being planned, protected and managed. The North District Plan also sets planning priorities and came out in conjunction with that region plan, and also talks about retaining and managing industrial and urban services land. It talks as well about growing and investing in health and education precincts. And those of you who would have listened to the Artarmon webinar last week will know that that St Leonard's Crow's Nest area is one of Sydney's health and education precincts. And we talked a lot about that then. We're in the Eastern Economic Corridor here in Willoughby, and that is something that in this district we want to see creating better connections for and being as competitive as it can be, and supporting the growth of targeted industry sectors. And although not relevant necessarily for today as a complete picture of how our industrial lands are being affected in Willoughby, the draft plan for St Leonard's and Crow's Nest also impacts on our Artarmon industrial area. But as I say, not necessarily relevant for East Chatswood and Lane Cove North today. The other plans that, that you may be aware of course, that the Council has produced and works under and is delivering on is our CSP, our Future Willoughby 2028, our Community Strategic Plan, which has priorities about developing businesses and diversifying our economy, including creative and innovative industries. The LSPS that I mentioned before, which sets that 20-year strategic direction for Willoughby, talks about protecting the role of Willoughby's industrial lands as urban service hubs for the lower North Shore. Our lands, our industrial lands, play a very important role across the whole district, quite well beyond Willoughby's own local government area boundaries. Our industrial lands position statement, which came out in 2017, raised the issue about the ensuring we have a sufficient supply of industrial land for the next 20 years in Willoughby, and recognises the importance of industrial lands to fulfil our urban service needs across the metropolitan area. It's also a source of generating local, diverse and skilled jobs, jobs that you wouldn't necessarily get in other parts of the local government area in hospitality or retail. Our Green City Plan is also an important document that we refer to here with our industrial land strategy. That's where we go to find the Council's endorsement of expanding Council's electric vehicle fleet and expanding the community electric vehicle charging network, which is something we'd like to see also extended into our industrial areas and beyond the normal commercial areas. Other reports that set the background for our industrial lands work are a report that we had done by SGS Economics and Planning a few years ago now, an economic study of Willoughby, but we still rely on the work that was done through that, which talks about there being insufficient zoned land available in the North District to accommodate the growth in urban service jobs, and that we need to provide for at least 2,000 additional industrial and urban service jobs by 2031. Of which the lion's share would be in Artarmon, but also something in the order of 400 in East Chatswood industrial area. Land values in this part of Sydney for industrial areas are double elsewhere in Sydney, and rents are also more expensive, almost 50% higher than in other parts of Sydney. However, the job densities that you get in this part of metropolitan Sydney are 3 times the average of the Sydney region. They work very hard, these industrial areas, in servicing this more inner area of the metropolitan region. The Department of Planning, Industry and Environment's Employment Lands Development Monitor also reports on the demand and supply of industrial lands, both in Sydney and the Central Coast. And that confirms the importance of industrial lands in the North District, where we have the lowest supply of these lands in Sydney, and yet, as I said earlier, the highest number of jobs per hectare. A thought piece that was issued by the Greater Sydney Commission to support work being done on industrial lands in strategic planning across Sydney was a metropolis that works, and that was issued back in 2018. And we've drawn quite heavily on this document to help inform our direction for our industrial lands. This document recognises that great cities are more than their residential neighbourhoods. They're made up of many different aspects of urban life. It confirms the crucial role industrial and urban service lands play in the day-to-day function of a city, which is almost obvious to say, but often not thought about specifically. And it warns that relinquishing them in the face of those shorter term imperatives for changes of use to maybe other commercial or residential uses is likely to be costly in the long term. Once they've moved to a higher value use, it's very unlikely we'll ever get them converted back. And the declaration of new industrial lands is something that would be extremely difficult to do in an already developed city. So it affirms that sufficient industrial lands with access to markets is integral to the delivery of the 30-minute city, which is the city that the GSC aspires for, Sydney, that we can all access the services and amenities that we need, our jobs and those other services that we rely upon, quickly by public transport from all parts of the urban area, of the metropolitan area. We've also reflected on what the post-COVID world means for our industrial and manufacturing lands. Over the course of recent history, these lands have been looked at for other opportunities, and some industrial lands in our existing metropolitan area have indeed been rezoned, not necessarily in Willoughby, but in other parts of metropolitan Sydney. But arguably these lands will be more important as we re-examine our industrial and productive base in the future and try to become more self-reliant following COVID-19. There are benefits recognized from manufacturing goods locally because we've seen how fragile our global supply chains have been. And when borders close, we are really in a fix if we have no means of providing the things and delivering the things we need close to hand. So the Grattan Institute has commented that clearly the crisis has exposed Australia didn't have adequate domestic supplies or productive capacity for things like the critical health equipment that we needed through the COVID pandemic. So here is an opportunity to recognise again the importance of industrial lands across a city like Sydney. It's an opportunity to rethink our strategy and our supply chain at a national level, says Ernst & Young. So this is part of the commentary that we will have all seen, I think, in terms of the post-COVID world, that our industrial lands may arguably become even more important and will do so increasingly in the future. So we've already been working on our industrial land strategy for 3 years now, since 2017, and our position paper was issued. We engaged the community at that point, and we also engaged them again on these issues in our LSPS, our local strategic planning statement, which looked at all aspects of strategic planning across the Willoughby local government area for 20 years hence. We finished that LSPS, and with that final LSPS, we had agreed priorities relating to industrial lands, so we're reflecting on those in our draft strategy, although we still need and seek your feedback as to how that will finally settle in terms of a final industrial lands strategy. What we were told in terms of the position statement and the draft LSPS was, yes, there was general support for protection of the industrial lands. Not universal, I have to say, but there was still general and majority support for that. It was recognized that these are important locations for our urban services, and there was a desire still to see some increased floor space ratio, some capacity to increase, and give an incentive for redevelopment maybe of the older industrial premises on our industrial lands. There was support too for a wider variety of industrial uses and diversity of employment opportunities. We think that our zones are very permissive. They do allow many different sorts of uses in terms of what is permissible in the IN1 and IN2 zones, but maybe there is a wider variety of uses we can still consider. There was a desire to manage the number of bulky goods outlets that may prevail in our industrial areas. And interestingly, some support for streetscape improvements and traffic and parking improvements, which is something people desire to see across the whole local government area, and industrial lands are no exception. So our general principles that we've based our industrial land strategy on are about protecting, retaining and managing the lands, improving and managing traffic and freight movement. There's no silver bullet for these issues. There will always be concerns and difficulties, but managing and trying to improve over time will be our aim. to promote and provide for land uses that indeed responds to changing technologies and market requirements. Things will maybe be very different in 10 years to the way they are now, of course. We need to capitalize on existing road, rail, and technology infrastructure, support and promote business clusters where they are arising, and encourage and incentivize more sustainable and technological initiatives. So those are some of our general principles for the future of industrial lands. Some other general initiatives for all our industrial areas are to, as I say, increase the FSR in all IN2 zones for sites over 1,000 square meters for a little bit extra from 1.5 FSR to 2.1. 2 to 1, sorry, FSR. We've taken a strong position on childcare centres, and we are suggesting that they be prohibited in all of Willoughby's industrial areas, and with a view to them seeking more preferable locations elsewhere in the interest of the health and well-being of the children who attend those centres, and for the freer movement and running and operation of the industrial areas where they would otherwise have been located. To incentivize energy efficiency and smart technology, to improve amenity, including tree canopy. These areas stick out quite obviously when you're looking at the urban heat island effect in any local government area. These are not areas that are generally well landscaped or greened, so there would be an opportunity, we think, through our work following the strategy to include improve amenity through improving and increasing the tree canopy, and improving road transport infrastructure generally. So let's focus now on the two industrial areas specifically. And the first we'll talk about is the East Chatswood industrial area. In terms of this area, it's about 1.5 k's from Chatswood CBD. It's close to Eastern Valley Way, one of its main access points. And it's approximately half the size of the Artarmon industrial area, at around 26 hectares. It has its origins as an industrial area in terms of its use of Scott's Creek as a water source for the use of the area for tanneries and other noxious activities. So this started in the 19th century. I think it was called Tanning Town or something at one, Tannery Town, because it was so used by different tannery companies. So that was where it started back in the 19th century, 1800s. And Scott's Creek runs through the area from the west to east, and the land slopes down towards Scott's Creek from the north and south. Compared to Artarmon, East Chatswood has a greater interface with the residential areas, which we're very conscious of. And we've had some questions today which already relate to that. And the main vehicle access points are Eastern Valley Way, as I've said before, and Eastern Valley and Victoria Avenue in the south. I'll just remind you, if you have any questions that you might have as I go through this webinar, you can enter them into the chat function found at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse over that, you'll be able to ask a question. So in terms of the range of uses that we would like to see in terms of character and place for East Chatswood, they're typical of a local industrial and urban services precinct here. We think there is quite a good range of use, although traditional manufacturing is decreasing here. There are still important small-scale manufacturers. The current uses include panel beaters and car repair services, like all of our industrial areas, home renovation services, and those other things in the list on the slide. Food preparation companies, indoor recreation uses such as gyms and places of worship and childcare centres are already here. So this is, of course, a pre-COVID analysis of what exists in East Chatswood. We haven't done a post-COVID analysis of who survived this pandemic. And that may be an interesting thing we will have to do before we finalize this strategy, because the world has indeed changed, as we know. So businesses related to retail, wholesale trades, the construction industry, manufacturing, and media and communications also dominate the industrial area, or as I say, indeed did do before the COVID pandemic. This provides you with a snapshot of the zoning of the area. It's all IN2, light industrial zone, unlike Artarmon, where there are large areas of general industrial, IN1. And you can see from the zoning map how close that residential area is right up against the industrial area. So that is a concern, of course, and an issue that we will have to deal with going forward. So I have two slides that talk about the key directions that we're proposing for East Chatswood to retain and encourage a flexible IN2 light industrial zone. We're allowing a wide range of modified building formats. We want to continue to prohibit residential development and promote the light industrial uses. Maybe limit the extent of non-bulky goods retailing in the area, because there is, and limit it to the area approved for a supermarket and associated specialty shops, adequate to cater, we think, for the existing and future employees of the area. So that is something that we would like to see contained in that particular part of East Chatswood industrial area. As I said before, we are considering increasing the floor space ratio for sites greater than 1,000 square meters to 2:1 FSR. And maybe permit pet daycare, which has been something that we have been pressed on in recent months as an additional permitted use on sites that particularly aren't adjacent to residential areas. So maybe this is one industrial area where we could indeed look at permitting that pet daycare facility, which is a very difficult use to locate, as we all know. Maybe this could be one place that we could look at accepting those. Investigate improvements to local traffic management, particularly with the approval of Woolworths in Smith Street, that full-line supermarket that brings with it issues to do with traffic management, as we know, and we've had a question about that already today. Supporting proposals that are consistent with the zoning, of course, and that improve the precinct, including enhanced community and amenity upgrades. So this should be no different from other development areas in that the public amenity should not be forgotten when development is being considered in these industrial areas. And indeed support the upgrade of Eastern Valley Way, which is a state road, to reinforce its role serving the industrial area. Our second slide of key directions is providing a road network that permits safe access and circulation for larger freight vehicles serving the industrial area. Freight traffic movements, of course, are always a cause for concern, particularly in an area like this with such close residential neighbours. To progress traffic and car parking management improvements as our own Willoughby integrated transport strategy progresses, in order to support the operation of the area and discourage the use of High Street by traffic generated by the industrial area, because High Street, of course, leads straight into the industrial area from the south. To reinforce and strengthen existing public transport services, these will be more important as we go forward in the future, as well as active transport initiatives such as walking and cycling for employees and visitors. So this is a general trend for the way that we are trying to manage our transport and traffic increases into the future. To support energy efficient and smart infrastructure such as electric vehicle charging stations and intelligent transport systems, which we talk about to quite a degree in our draft integrated transport strategy as well. As I said before, investigate improvements to urban tree canopy and provide some employee amenity as a result of that. Prohibit childcare centres in this industrial area and continue to ensure appropriate interface considerations with the residential areas around by controlling noise, odour, hours of operation and parking. And turning now finally to the closing slides of my presentation. We're just getting to about halfway through. It's coming up for 1:30. Lane Cove North Industrial Area, which is in the west of our local government area. So this Epping Road industrial area, some people refer to it as, we call it Lane Cove North, comprises two major sites of around 3 hectares altogether. We have 63 Epping Road, which is occupied by NUS removalists and has been for quite a long time. and 170 Epping Road, which until recently was occupied by National Starch Proprietary Limited. This area lies at the northern end of a much larger industrial area, which is within Lane Cove Council, which they refer to as Lane Cove West Industrial Area, and that has over 50 hectares of industrial land, something similar to our Tarman industrial area, but we have just the very northern pocket at the very top. 170 Epping Road is partly, in fact, in Willoughby and partly in Lane Cove, and sits on that bend in the Lane Cove River, and did house, as I've said, a starch mill, which was operating for over 100 years, with that industry relying on the river for transport. In recent years, there has been some incursion of residential development on nearby sites, both in Lane Cove and Willoughby. The confirmation that industrial lands, however, are of strategic value in this area is reinforced by a decision. We were talking to our colleagues across the border in Lane Cove recently. They had a decision at 166 Epping Road to refuse a change of use from IN2 to mixed use with residential. So that was an issue that was fought. The local planning panel, who provide advice to local councils on planning proposals such as this, talked about the proposal conflicting with the North District Plan, which acknowledges the need to retain and manage industrial and urban services land and prevent the conversion of land to residential development, including mixed-use zonings. And they did not support the proposal to lose the industrial land, the IN2 land, on that basis. It went to the Sydney North Planning Panel. It was appealed with the panel, and they also did not support the planning proposal, and rejected it, noting that the retention of industrially zoned land for future employment growth is a higher priority than providing more residential land. So that was a very interesting decision that we are reflecting on as we move forward with our industrial land strategy and the protection we suggest of this northern part of Lane Cove West, our Lane Cove North industrial area. There you can see the zoning. You can see the green line, or it looks green on my screen, which divides the local government area. So you have 170 Epping Road, partly in Lane Cove, partly in Willoughby, and the 63 Epping Road here, which is the NUS removalists, both zoned IN2. So our key directions for this small industrial area are to retain the IN2 light industrial zone and protect it from non-employment uses such as residential and retail by resisting proposals seeking rezoning. As in common with our other industrial areas, to consider a higher FSR to provide incentives for redevelopment and new enterprises. We'll be interested to have feedback on that in particular. To prepare a site-specific development control plan, in fact, in conjunction with Lane Cove Council for the future of Epping Road in the longer term, with regard to its foreshore location and the proximity to other residential land uses and public open space. So that site in particular probably needs some very careful attention going forward, so we set a very clear strategic direction. And to prohibit new childcare centres in the Lane Cove North Industrial Zone, in common, as I say, with our other industrial areas. So the second and final key directions sheet that we're talking about today is the progress of traffic and car parking management improvements as part of the integrated transport strategy, so that the operation of the area works as well as it can, and more minor roads such as Mowbray Road West are discouraged in their use in association with this industrial area. To reinforce public transport access and active transport initiatives for employees and visitors, and again, that direction about supporting energy efficient and smart infrastructure with the EV charging stations and the intelligent transport systems, which covers all of our industrial areas. So that gives you hopefully a good snapshot of what the draft industrial land strategy talks about, the key directions it proposes, and invites your views and invites you to make a submission until the 20th of July. And you can see this webinar, as I say, later on. It'll be on the council website. You can review it and remind yourself about some of the issues, although it is all contained in the draft industrial land strategy. And this final strategy, when made and agreed with council, will of course go forward next year as we review and revise our LEP and our DCP, thus giving legal effect to all the changes that we talk about in this strategy. So I'll turn now to the questions that, first of all, the questions that we've received earlier on prior to this webinar. So I can talk about the questions, those questions first, and then we'll see if there are any further questions that have been submitted during the course of the webinar. We'll try and provide answers. There won't be, I don't think, absolute answers to all the questions you ask, because many of them will have had long histories and will have even longer futures to resolve, no doubt, because they are complex issues. So if I turn first to the question that Erin Meekan provided to us and sent up, which was about a building that she felt was an eyesore in Gibbs Street. It was a concrete building that can be seen from a wide area around. What are we going to do about improving the eyesore, Erin asks. We recognize that this is not a particularly great outlook from different parts of this local area. We think it's important that we review the DCP controls that we have in place, and maybe we increase the consideration of building design when viewed from outside of the industrial areas, the way we're thinking, with the inclusion of greater landscaping, particularly at the rear of buildings that can be seen outside the industrial area. Not a particularly easy thing to resolve. Industrial construction is not something that we focus our urban design attention on normally, but there is probably no reason why we should not improve the appearance of buildings from without an industrial area of those buildings that lie inside. So I take your point. I sympathize with the outlook of a building that doesn't look particularly great from outside of the industrial area. The second question Erin asked was about traffic flow during peak times on Eastern Valley Way North, turning into Smith Street. And it will only get worse, says Erin, with the startup of Woolworths. How can we minimize disruption during this work that will be undertaken and ongoing? So these traffic issues on Eastern Valley Way, vis-a-vis particularly the development of the Woolworths site in Smith Street, are of course well known, and council officers have been working on this issue for some considerable time. Eastern Valley Way is a state road, so we've been working in conjunction with Transport for New South Wales on improvements to Eastern Valley Way, and in particular improvements to that junction with Smith Street with the advent of Woolworths. So this is something that is receiving intense attention now, and that will continue so that we get a result that will hopefully be certainly no worse than the situation at the moment, and will maintain traffic flows, even if they're not able to be improved in any large way, but at least maintain the level of service that is experienced at that junction. The third question Erin asked is about, she talks about video surveillance of the junction at Smith Street, which is considered to be an accident hotspot, she says. I think probably what we would be exploring here could be CCTV cameras or speed cameras, maybe, is what Erin is seeking to have introduced in that junction. Again, at this junction is a matter for Transport for New South Wales, but this can certainly be discussed going forward to improve the function of this junction, particularly as it gets busier with the Woolworths store. So thank you for those questions, Erin, and hopefully the responses have gone some way to answering those questions. That was the first of 5 questions, but I wonder if Councillors Chuan or Councillor Saville have any questions that they might like to ask before I move on to the second question that we received before the webinar. Councillor Chuan?
Hi, Norma. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
I'm sorry, I was unable to unmute myself previously, but yes, I do have a question with regarding to, I know that Chatswood has a greater interface with the residential area, whereas in Artarmon probably does not exhibit the same sort of characteristics. So what would you say would be the major differences in the strategies for the two different areas?
I think we have to be very sensitive about the way that the Chatswood East local government industrial area works in terms of noise, parking, and any sort of disruption to the residential areas around. It's a question of applying a greater degree of sensitivity, I think, in terms of uses that, particularly on the edge of the industrial area, are permitted, and then how they operate. So we have to be more careful, I think, in Chatswood East. Perhaps it just has that extra level of difficulty in terms of the operation of uses within it. So it's an IN2 zone as opposed to an IN1. So particularly those heavier industrial uses such as concrete batching and waste recycling are not present in Chatswood East Chatswood as they are in Artarmon. So maybe this is a clue to how we operate East Chatswood into the future with a respect and consideration for the residential areas around.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Norma. That's actually answered my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Saville, would you have a question? Maybe Councillor Saville hasn't been able to join us this afternoon. So in that case, I'll move on to the second question that we received before we conducted the webinar. This is a question from Joanna Dodkin-Smith. Joanna asks a similar question to Councillor Chuen, actually, how residential amenity will be protected. Will the design of new buildings allow for more green space and landscape ratios? So certainly, as I've said to Councillor Chuen in my response to her question, protection for the residential areas is very important. I think going forward we'll be more, what shall I say, innovative in terms of the way we provide for overall amenity improvements and street tree planting, particularly as part of any new development proposals, and the encouragement of walking and cycling by making the general amenity of the area more pleasant for doing these things. And tree canopy is one of those things that improves the inclination of people to walk and cycle in an area. So it is a difficult situation to have residential and industrial so close together, such close neighbours. But knowing that we want to protect these lands for ongoing productivity and different sorts of uses that are not appropriate elsewhere in the local government area, that will remain, we believe. That's what we're proposing in the strategy, but with consideration and care taken to minimise the impacts on the nearby residential area. So that's a response for Joanna to her question about protecting residential amenity. We have a third question that was supplied beforehand from Claude Diciano. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Claude's surname correctly there. Claude asks, is there a plan to rezone or repurpose the land? And presumably he means East Chatswood, but he may also mean Lane Cove North. But you can see it's apparent from the presentation we've given outlining the direction in our draft industrial land strategy. There's no plan to rezone our industrial lands. Indeed, retain and manage is the message that we hope you've heard loud and clear through this afternoon's webinar. The fourth question came from Melinda Stewart, which talks about the management of parking issues for residents in Barcoo Street, which is to the northwest of the East Chatswood industrial area, and how will we protect residential amenity from increased traffic and hours of operation. Certainly the management of parking issues is ongoing, and we're very aware of the long-standing issues, particularly in Barcoo Street, in and around that area with the operation of the industrial area. So there's no sweet answer, no glib response, I'm afraid, this afternoon to how these issues will be managed. It's an ongoing concern for us that we do this as well as we can. And certainly traffic impacts will always be examined and managed in terms of any new development proposals that we receive. This is always a very important aspect of our assessment and often draws the most local commentary when you have either a planning proposal or a DA to consider. The traffic and transport issues often are the most contentious. Melinda also talks about traffic lights at Ashley Street and Penshurst Street, and allowing some turning arrows to make it easier for residents to move around the area through that junction. Traffic lights on any of the roads, of course, are a Transport for New South Wales issue, as we know. And again, the issue of varying the traffic light arrangement here at the junction is something that we can raise with Transport for New South Wales going forward. So hopefully I've tried to answer Melinda's question there about parking issues in Baku and generally traffic impacts being managed. The last question we had before the webinar began was to do with rezoning land again. It's from Andrew Thornthwaite, and Andrew asks, will land currently used for industry be made available for residential? Well, I think you've heard my message this afternoon that this is not the intention, that industrial land is of such strategic value to Willoughby and indeed to the whole of the North District and arguably the whole of the metropolitan region. There's no intention to rezone industrial land for residential purposes. Rather, the strategy aims to protect these lands. So those are the questions that we've received thus far that I hope I've provided a reasonable response to. I know they're not complete answers in that we have a definitive response to make and we can give timeframes and absolutes to those questions. Anything often to do with traffic and transport management is something that's part of a bigger system and a bigger management issue as this city grows going forward. If anyone has got any other questions, Tanya, I'll ask if there's anybody forwarded a new question while we've been on the webinar. I don't think I've seen anything.
It looks like the question from Melinda that came through the chat's probably already been answered by a question that was submitted earlier to you in the submission. Yes. But the one from Joanna is new in the chat as well, if you want to respond to that one.
Yes, Joanna asks about the amenity where there's the residential interface, as we've talked about before, restrictions regarding hours of business, lighting, noise, and traffic impacts on residents are something that we deal with in terms of conditions of consent when we assess developments. I'm not sure that there's much more to say about that, except that we are particularly vigilant with recognizing the importance of setting parameters around these things, having residential developments so close by. So the amenity of residential areas is paramount here. But equally important is the good functioning of our industrial area. So they're not necessarily good neighbors for each other. If you live near an industrial area, you probably wish you didn't. But this is an area that's important for the strategic positioning of Willoughby going forward for our service hub needs and our urban services generally as the city grows. So we have to get on with each other. So I think that if that's the limit of the questions we've received this afternoon, maybe we get an early mark from the webinar if nobody has anything else to ask. I'll reiterate that the webinar will be put onto the website so you can watch it again and see the slide deck again. The important thing about this afternoon is to make you aware of what we're proposing in the draft industrial land strategy. Pass this on to friends, neighbours and colleagues because we want to see as many submissions on this draft strategy as we can. We intend it to be a quick turnaround to reach a final strategy so that the content of that final industrial land strategy can inform our new LEP next year. And that is our intention, that we lock down the controls and proposals in our statutory document, our LEP, as soon as we can. So This is all aiming to a good end, we hope, and we'd like to hear your submissions on the directions we've posed in this draft strategy. So I thank you for your attention this afternoon, and that would be the close of the webinar, I think. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Norma. It's Christine here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thuan.